Well, perhaps not surprisingly, in a book that covers such a huge span of history, we find pandemics, or what used to be called plagues, occurring again and again in the Bible, really from the very start to the end of the story. The first time we come across plagues are in the book of Exodus at the time of Israel's enslavement in Egypt. And the last time we come across them is in the book of Revelation, the Bible's final book, where in 8 of its chapters we find plagues, sometimes on a quarter of the earth, sometimes on a third of the earth, sometimes on the whole. That's a real pandemic there. So, yes, we do find pandemics or plagues in the Bible story. And I think as I've reflected on them, two things stand out to me from all of those. The first is that every time they serve as a wake-up call to the human race. If we think, for example, of the very first occurrence of a plague in Exodus, those well-known 10 plagues sent against Egypt. Now, please remember, these weren't just 10 nasty things thought up by a cruel god in heaven against cruel Egyptians who were enslaving the Israelites. They were all actually challenges to Egypt to come into line with God. And so the story begins not with plague, but with Moses and Aaron going to Pharaoh and saying, on God's behalf, let my people go. You've enslaved them. This is wrong. You are living wrongly. Let my people go. And of course, Pharaoh repeatedly says no. And even when the first plague comes along, it's accompanied there by Moses saying, God says again, let my people go. Get your life into line with what I want and how I want people to live. So it's a wake-up call to Egypt there, that they cannot go on living in the way that they have chosen. And every single one of those 10 plagues that follows is a challenge to Egypt's gods, because every plague either was a challenge to a representation of an Egyptian god, or to an area of life that an Egyptian god had rule over. So these are not just 10 nasty things that happen. These are 10 challenges to the very fundamentals of what Egyptians believed in. And God's using them as a wake-up call to call them to live differently. It's interesting, the same thing occurs when we go right to the end of the Bible story and to that book of Revelation. And there, the plagues, the pandemics that come upon the earth are on an increasingly godless world. But it's as if through them, God is crying out to people saying, change, live life differently. Don't live it so selfishly. Don't invest in what it calls Babylon, the world system with all the stuff there that's so wrong. So I think that's the first thing that strikes me, Dave, about pandemics or plagues in the Bible, is they consistently serve as a wake-up call. And goodness, I think today's pandemic is a wake-up call to us as human beings, isn't it? To how very much we need both God and each other. You know, we've developed a world where we like to think we've got everything under control. Science has the answer to everything. I can get what I want. But actually, you know, we don't have everything under control. We are a little less infallible than we like to think. Our self-reliance and coping mechanisms aren't quite as good as we thought. And for me, through all of this, horrible as it is, there is something of a wake-up call to us, to call us back to God and to say, you really do need me. And the sort of life and society you end up building without me and without my guidelines ends up leading to this kind of thing. I think the second thing that strikes me from tracking the whole Bible story is that whenever God's people intercede in such times, God always steps in. So here's just a couple of examples. I've chosen a different one, first of all. It's a plague that came upon the Israelites themselves in their wilderness journey from Egypt to the Promised Land, serving as a wake-up call to them after the rebellion of Korah. But I want to read to you from Numbers chapter 16, verses 46 to 48, which are some powerful words for us at this time. Then Moses said to Aaron, "Take your censer and put incense in it, along with fire from the altar, and hurry to the assembly to make atonement for them. Wrath has come out from the Lord. The plague has started." So Aaron did as Moses said and ran into the midst of the assembly. The plague had already started among the people, but Aaron offered the incense and made atonement for them. He stood between the living and the dead, and the plague stopped. What a powerful verse that is. He stood between the living and the dead, and the plague stopped. What a great opportunity this is for God's people to seek God as never before, to stand in that gap between the living and the dead, and to call out to God for his mercy, even on a people who don't deserve it, because the Israelites didn't deserve God's mercy at that moment, but God showed it as someone went and stood in the gap and prayed. They stood between the living and the dead, and the plague stopped. And the second example I've got of many is out of the plague that came as a wake-up call after David's prideful census that he took towards the end of his reign, just wanting to know how many people and how many troops he's got and what a great king I am. And it's like, in this context, the plague serves as a wake-up call here to pride. But again, look what happens. So this one is from 2 Samuel chapter 24, verse 18 to 25. On that day, Gad went to David and said to him, "Go up and build an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite." So David went up as the Lord had commanded through Gad. And when Araunah looked and saw the king and his men coming towards him, he went out and bowed down before the king with his face to the ground. And Araunah said, "Why has my lord the king come to his servant?" "To buy your threshing floor," David answered, "so that I can build an altar to the Lord, that the plague on the people may be stopped." He wanted a point of connection between heaven and earth where he could call out to God at this altar. And Araunah said to David, "Let my lord the king take whatever pleases him and offer it up. Here are oxen for the burnt offering, and here are threshing sledges and ox yokes for the wood. O king, Araunah gives all this to the king." Araunah also said to him, "May the Lord your God accept you." But the king replied to Araunah, "No, I insist on paying you for it. I will not sacrifice to the Lord my God burnt offerings that cost me nothing." So David bought the threshing floor and the oxen and paid 50 shekels of silver for them. David built an altar to the Lord, and there sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings. Then the Lord answered prayer on behalf of the land, and the plague on Israel was stopped. So I think for me, two things there, Dave, out of what we are encountering at the moment, put against the big story of the Bible. The first is that plagues generally serve as a wake-up call to people to look again at what matters, what they are building life on, and where God fits in that, and what sort of community they really want to build. The second one is that wherever God's people take this seriously, my goodness, that cost David money there at the end to buy that threshing floor for the altar. So there's sacrifice involved. But wherever God's people will cry out to him seriously, earnestly, God hears their cry and intervenes. And surely that's a challenge for us as a church today, to take that seriously, to stand in the gap and to cry out to God that he might have mercy, but also to pray that out of this time, society and life will never be the same again, and we will rebuild it very differently.